everybody. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. There it goes. I'm the warm-up act for Johnny, so this is sort of, want to make sure that post-lunch is the hardest slot as a speaker. So we picked somebody who would, I knew that would really engage you and give you information and present an important perspective. I've known Dr. Johnny Rice II for, I don't know, 15, 20 years. We met in Baltimore years ago. We've been colleagues, focusing on the issue of domestic violence, focusing on the issue of fathers for years. I know Johnny's work, I respect him deeply. And this is the second time you're here. And he's going to be giving his talk, and I'm going to make sure I get the title right. It's, fathers who use violence, prioritizing child and victim safety. And, and one of the things that we share is this deep, deep commitment that it's the work with men is so important. The idea that men matter, men's choices matter to their families, matter to their communities, I know is really important to both of us. And that you have to be able to approach that question about how do you work with them, how do you help them, without giving up an ounce on victim safety. Without giving up any bit of helping and thinking about the needs of children, adult survivors, and really believing that you can do both things. So I think you're going to be really excited about his talk. His bio is impressive. He's the assistant professor of criminal justice at Coppin State University, a historically black university. Previously a senior program associate with a supervised visitation initiative at the Vera Institute of Justice in their Center on Victimization and Safety. Johnny spent the past 17 years providing leadership, technical assistance, and support to organizations that serve low-income fathers and families in areas of child welfare, youth development, and criminal justice in efforts to create safe and stable communities. He currently serves as a National Steering Committee member of the Institute on Domestic Violence in the African American Community, Constituent Advisory Board member of the National Domestic Violence Hotline, and Board President for the National Resource Center on Domestic Violence. Johnny has a BS and MS degree in Criminal Justice from the University of Baltimore and holds a Doctor of Public Health degree from Morgan State University's School of Community Health and Policy, where his studies emphasis was violence prevention and intervention. He currently serves as adjunct faculty for Penn State's World University, and maybe the most important thing, I don't know, it says in his bio, is a proud husband and father. We were just talking about our families together. So please give a warm welcome to Johnny Rice.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Before I get started, I would like to show a short video clip just to provide some context. And it's kind of a grounding for the presentation that I plan to give.
When I was 7, my parents would argue, and it appeared that a lot of the arguments were based upon my father, particularly when he was drinking in the household. And what I do remember is incidents where my father may have hit my mother, and how angry it made me and how upset it made me. But at the same token, I felt very helpless at a young age to do anything about it. Incidents of violence continued to escalate, but I also saw how my mother tried to shield my sister and I from being exposed to it by taking us over to other relatives' houses, by trying to explain to us that things would get better. And as a mother who was trying to keep it together, she had a lot of weight on her as well. And for a 3-day period, we were actually at a shelter in Maryland, a domestic violence shelter. And believe it or not, it was 3 of the most peaceful days of my life as a young person, because we didn't have to worry about the arguing, the screaming, any type of hitting or abuse. But there was a situation where he was binge drinking, and I was a college student, but I was also staying with him. And I was getting very frustrated and angry because whenever he would binge drink, You know, you couldn't, it was very unpredictable. And so this one day I said, okay, look, the door is locked. I was banging on the door. I was like, open up the door. I need to get my stuff. I want to get my stuff out of here. He had people up there with them. They were drinking too, people from the community, from the neighborhood. And so I was just to a point, banging on the door. I want my stuff. I opened the door. His friend was there at the bottom of the steps who was also drunk. And I said, hey, I want my damn stuff, and I'm coming up to get it. My father said, oh, you're not gonna get a damn thing. I said, yes, I am. I'm getting my stuff. So as I go up those steps, he comes back to the top of the steps with a firearm. And he lets go one shot. First of all, I can't believe, okay, I don't even believe this is happening. I go duck right back around the corner. Right next to his office was a liquor store. And I knew the owner of the liquor store, and the owner came out and said, what was that? It was a gunshot. I said, yes. I said, my father just shot at me. He said, I can't believe this. I said, he just shot at me. Call the police. So the police came. They went up into the office. They brought my father out. They locked him up. And a part of me was glad that finally maybe this needed to happen to end this drinking and the violence. But then another part of me was kind of torn because I was like, this isn't good either. My father finally, after that, said internally that he had to change. I define reconciliation, the ability to accept the past for what it was, but also the ability to move towards the future with hope, based on a positive, healthy outlook and mutual respect. I was at a church service. He talked about to the congregation some of the things that occurred within our household and how he was responsible for almost destroying our family. And he said that if it wasn't for my mother and the strength of us, you know, more than likely, you know, all of us would not have been in a better position than we are now. Seeing him publicly, you know, be accountable for his behavior, that helped to heal. Some people should have those conversations with their families when it's safe to do so. As I had with my father to say, hey, I love you, but what was this all about? There's a reality that in some situations, individuals may not have that opportunity or may not choose to do so, but they still need to find a way to process that same conversation with someone who is trusted, someone who understands their experience, that will help them to unleash their emotions in a healthy way so they can move on. And also, I'll say this, working with other families and strengthening them and sharing with them is also something that strengthens myself. Healing is being able to educate yourself as to why it may have happened, not looking for excuses or any type of thing of that, but understanding what happened to you. And then being able to move to a point where you talk about healing, as I mentioned, acceptance of then processing that hurt and being able to pull off of those things that are strengths so you can let it go. The anger go, let the pain go. And a part of that also is being able to hold people accountable for what has happened, if not directly, indirectly, but then be able to take that, understand it, and move on and take that negative energy and turn it into a positive energy. I know of too many situations in working with families in which healing is not even something that is considered. The acceptance, and then there's also the process of engaging support circles, family, your faith. Those elements, those things are a continuum, or part of a continuum of healing. And lastly, the closure, being able to move from that point so you can move to the next pathway in your life in a healthy way.
I want to thank the Safe and Together Institute for championing this cause. I want to recognize the organization's sponsors, as well as you all who are here today and committed to creating a brighter future for our children. You know, this institute has done a great job of bringing together policymakers, researchers, but most importantly, practitioners, individuals who work with families, work with clients, be it children, victims of domestic violence, as well as those individuals who have used violence against their loved ones. David Mandel, Kyle Pinto, the whole team, I'm appreciative to be a guest here. And I always don't take lightly the opportunity to speak and to share my story. And let me say this, as someone who has attended these type of conferences throughout the years, it's great that you are here. Some people may be checking their phones and seeing what's happening back at the office, and it can be some anxiety and frustration because you know that even though you're here, the work doesn't stop. But I do want to say to you, it is important as someone who is a helper, who works to help others, that you stop and take care of yourself and refuel and retool. So this conference is a way for you to be able to do that. Several years ago, I spoke to good friends in IDVAC who were like, Johnny, you have a powerful story, because we would talk and share stories amongst one another. And they said, would you be willing to film that story? I said, I don't know, let me think about it. I spoke to my father, and I said, how would you feel if I talked about some of our experiences? He said, hey, it's your truth, and I'm on board. The reality of what happened is what happened, and any way I can support that, I will. My father also agreed to record a video, and there is a video clip of him talking about his experience and the impact his violence had on the family. So I'm here today to share a little bit of my story, hoping that it can resonate, if not but one person, and inspire you to maybe share your story. Now, let me say this, in this age of internet trolls, an age where people will put together memes of your experience and laugh at it, in a time where there are critics who are ready to deconstruct your own truth, it's very easy to be quiet and not say anything and let someone else's story speak. But I've been inspired by those individuals who stepped up, stepped out, and shared their story as a way to inform others, to educate others, to empower others. And so what I hope today that I'm able to do is to have you consider the lens in which you look at your work. Consider what informs that lens, be it personal experiences, be it your professional experiences, be it how you were raised, be it your culture. All of those things poured into this pot of the wonderful person that is you creates who you are. But it's also a mirror to others that you worked to help. And I also want you to think about that lens that you see yourself. Do others see you that same way when you work to connect with them? I hope that I can inspire the practitioners, policymakers, and researchers, because as you know, in this world, we need inspiration. You can look at any major news website or blog, we can pull it up, and I can find probably 2 or 3 stories of death, hatred, and harm towards children. That's the reality. Now, some people may say, well, Dr. Rice, the media promotes some of this, but it is a reality in our communities. And we are the people who usually see the worst of the worst. And we're the individuals who come and try to turn things around. So what I hope that we can consider in terms of learning objectives is to, again, think about how you see the work that you do, heighten your understanding of the impacts on domestic violence through the story that I share, and understand that trauma and violence that one experiences just doesn't dissipate once that act ends. It can carry on and on and on into adulthood, into relationships, into the work environment. It can impact people in very detrimental ways. But most importantly, what I hope to do is to shine a light on responsible fatherhood programs and how they can be a vehicle for change. Some people may say, well, responsible fatherhood, if you're a father, you should just be responsible and do the things that you're supposed to do. The reality, we have young parents, older parents, who may not have had parents themselves and are struggling to figure things out. And when they don't have the support and guidance that they need, we often see the negativity that comes from that. What I believe, and I'm going to read this quote, it's from the late Kofi Annan. It says, "There's no trust more sacred than the one world holds with children. There's no duty more important than ensuring that their rights are respected, that their welfare is protected, that their lives are free from fear and want, and that they grow up in peace." I don't care if it's the most violent community in East Baltimore. I don't care if it's High Point, North Carolina. We all generally want peace for our children. Locally, globally, we want peace for our children. I wonder who that little cute fella is right there. Okay, I digress, let me keep going. Hatred. Where does hatred come from? Why would there be hate? Why would there be hatred? Well, I want to tell you why I had hatred as a young person. I had hatred because I didn't understand why I was in a situation in which my father was abusive to my mother, nor did my sister understand that. My father's violence created a very toxic environment, and I hated him for that. I hated him for his alcoholism. I hated him for disrespecting and belittling my mother by flaunting other women in her face. I hated him because he didn't meet his financial obligations and our lights would go off, and then I think the statute of limitations is gone. I had an uncle that used to kind of wire it back up. I think I'm all right there. We meant to edit that part out. But I hated him for that. From the age of 5 to 15, I can remember all of those things my father would do. Violent rages, cursing. When I hear certain songs or see certain cars, it reminds me of some of those moments. I also hated that I had family members who were supposed to be strong men who did nothing. And at that time, as a young person, I couldn't understand why these other men who knew what my father was doing, if this was my sister, I wouldn't have sat there and not do anything. But I didn't understand that there was also a complicated relationship that my uncles and my father had. But I was frustrated. And I was mad at my mother because I didn't understand why she just didn't get up and leave. This man was crazy. I'm like, he's crazy. He's a madman. Let's get out of here. Come on. But it wasn't that easy. They had a house together. They had been together for a long time. She loved him. She wanted to leave, but it wasn't easy. But then when she would find the strength to leave, and we would go with my grandmother or someone else. It would be short-lived. My father would say that he would change, he would be sober and for a while and do the things that he needed to do to try to present himself as an upright man and father. But as soon as we would move back in, guess what? The behavior would continue, the violent behavior over and over again. So one night when it was really violent and my mother grabbed us and called my grandmother and said, hey, I have to come tonight, my grandmother said, no, you're not coming here. I don't care where you go. I told you not to be in a relationship with them. You're on your own. I hated my grandmother for that. The anger, the frustration, and the hatred that I had was connected to those experiences in growing up. While things would eventually get better at that time, I didn't see that. As many young people that we work with, as we try to encourage them and coach them up, lift them up, mentor them up, and then they still don't react, and we wonder why. We're giving them our best self, but they seem depressed. They're not paying attention. They're frustrated, and why are they? Because of what they have seen, because of what they have heard. Now, I just didn't mention this hate to take you into a dark place. A lot of my work is focused on change, pathways to change, the ability to change. When I go to different cities and different states and talk about this issue, we talk about the potential for change. But I am a realist, and I do understand that there are some people who are dangerous and violent. So don't misconstrue my openness for change to a naivete to the violence that can occur in relationships and the things that a perpetrator will do to harm a loved one, directly or indirectly. You know, when you think about the lens that you look out of, ask yourself this: what moved you to this work? Was it something that you experienced yourself? Is it something that you saw that moved you? Because some of us get into this work because we try to change things based on what we did not have, or what we saw, where we saw the gaps. Why are you in this work? What's your investment? What moved you to do what you're doing today? You need to consider that, because it's something that can change over the years as we grow and we start to connect with families and children and their experiences. You know, it's interesting because while I told you all of these negative things about my father, I love my dad. I love my father. I said it that quick after all the other negative things I just said. I love my dad. Why did I love my dad? I love my dad for a couple different reasons. I love my dad because he was an excellent storyteller. I could sit in his office. He had a tax and accounting business in Northwest Baltimore. I would sit there and see people come in from different walks of life, and he would tell stories about his military days, tell stories about growing up in Denmark, South Carolina, and moving up to Baltimore and getting established in Baltimore. I loved hearing those stories. I loved how he connected with people from different walks of life. I don't care if it was a drug hustler from the community or a businessman from the community. He met them and connected with them like it was nothing, like they've been friends for years. I love seeing that. His ability to crunch numbers and to help people with tax issues. I loved and appreciated that. And I also loved how he supported other family members. Yet, it was kind of difficult and hard to reconcile these two different feelings. Because in one moment, I see this individual who is very articulate, very smart, and engaging, and there for his friends. But on the other side, I also have to balance this understanding that what you all didn't see or couldn't see was in our household, there was something else happening that was not good. I'm a part of a training institute that an organization, Futures Without Violence. They have a fatherhood, supervised visitation, domestic violence institute. And as a part of that institute, I work with a bunch of trainers. One of the trainers is Judge Sharon Chapman, and she often talks about this cognitive dissonance and how she always keeps certain things in mind in terms of the tug and the pull in doing this work when you think about change. So she is an ally of engaging men. She has a conference, she's had it several years for fathers in, I believe, the San Francisco community, and the conferences are to help those men to move forward in their life, men who may have challenges. And she loves it, and she loves those men. She sees the best. She sees potential in those men. But she said, Johnny, I also have to be honest. I have men who come into my court. I do murder cases, and I still have men who murder women. Men who murder women. She said, sometimes I have to really check myself, because on the one hand, I see the beauty of what can be with some resources and tools are given to fathers. But there's also the reality that there are dangerous men who don't want to change, who don't want the opportunity. But we both agree, Judge Chapman and I, that for those men who want to change and want the opportunity, there should be a path for them to be able to move forward. What helped me and what made a difference in my life was my mother did not give up. So even though there was a lot of dysfunctional things occurring, my mother continued to work her job. She was able to separate from my dad. She was able to get the home that's still our home, that she still lives in today. She was able to get control of the home. And we were raised in a stable environment at that point. She did a couple of things that I will always be indebted to her for. One, she got me involved in the Boy Scouts. Now, let me say this. When you grow up, and I grew up in urban Baltimore, pretty decent community, but you know, some of your friends like the Boy Scouts is good, but it's kind of corny. You know, it's not as cool as we want. You know, I'm just saying. You know, the Boy Scouts, trustworthy, loyal, helpful, friendly, courteous, kind, obedient, cheerful, thrifty, brave, clean, and reverent. You never forget this stuff. Stays with it. But it was one of the best things that she ever did, because by putting me in the Boy Scouts, I was around Mr. Williams. He was our scoutmaster, Mr. Williams. Now, we were kind of a wild bunch of youngsters, so Mr. Williams would use some language that wasn't exactly in the Boy Scout handbook. He would say some things and do some things, you know. He had a certain way about him. But we never doubted that he cared about us. And many of us at that time, and I say many of us, I'm talking about my peers who were in the Boy Scouts from West Baltimore, coming from single parent homes, he was that father. He was that masculine figure teaching us how to camp, how to do certain things. So you all may have heard of the movie Boys in the Hood. Well, we were boys in the woods, tying knots, camping, out in the air. But the key was to get us out of an environment that at times had other push and pulls and tugs. Tugs from gangs in the community, tugs from drug dealers in the community, tugs from peers who wanted to engage in deviant and violent acts. So having a Mr. Williams bringing us together, taking us places, was very helpful, and it provided some stability in our lives. And it's important to note that it wasn't just, this just doesn't apply to me, but what we see when we look at youth and resiliency is that there are some things that are very important in terms of protective factors. And I'm not going to go through all of them, but these spheres of individual, family, and community are important to take into context. Young people need understanding. They should have a space to unpack their experiences and not be judged. When I was at the domestic violence shelter, what I often remember was that there were other young children there, and we got to play and to talk to one another. And even though I didn't necessarily understand what the advocate was doing with my mom, I could tell that she was being helpful to my mom. That period helped us to get on our feet. My mother might not have made it if she didn't have that place to go. And remember, when my grandmother said that we couldn't come back to her home, that shelter was our home. And then we were able to connect with other family members who took us in until my mother could get back into our house. Role models, supportive relationships. You know, some of us may think that, well, if it's not someone who's a dad or biological, if there is a caring adult that's consistently involved in a child's life in a positive way, that's a good thing. And that's important. Supportive relationships. And lastly, community and access to services, mentors, and neighborhood cohesion. So when we went back to my mother's home, it was a stable neighborhood, and that was very helpful to us at that time. Now, I want you to think about what I have said to you in regards to my story, just up to this point. So, in my city, there are issues of domestic violence. We've had several women, very high percentage compared to previous years, who have lost their life as a result of domestic violence. I show you just to put in context where some of my hatred came from. Because as I got older, my hatred just didn't immediately dissipate. It went up a little bit because I started to understand that, wow, I made it to 16 in Baltimore on my own as a young man without another man guiding me through. So my anger was my father, knowing how Baltimore is, threw me to the wolves to figure it out on my own. Unacceptable. Now, don't get me wrong, Baltimore is a beautiful city. It's a city of neighborhoods. It's Baltimore. Someone knows someone who knows someone that then knows someone. I love Baltimore. So I will never speak negatively about my city. But the reality is that the crime compounded by poverty masks the stories of families that are dealing with issues such as abuse, trauma, neglect, and violence. So if people are shooting and killing one another, you can imagine the level of other challenges that are happening that are behind closed doors that don't make it to the surface. But even with all of the hatred that I had, the hopefulness came from being in the Boy Scouts with Mr. Williams. The hopefulness came from getting accepted to Baltimore City College, one of the oldest high schools in the country, a magnet school, just a school that gave me a sense of pride, being connected to something bigger than myself so that the issues that happened in my family life started to kind of fade to a degree as I was connecting with kids that were motivated and had positive outlooks on life. But even kids in high school still dealing with issues within their home, but still being in a supportive, nurturing environment with teachers who were supportive of us, teachers who said, you can do anything you dream of. hopefulness. I would use that fuel from Baltimore City College Senior High and the lessons learned to assist me in moving towards my goals to go to college. I put myself through school. I had a lot of love and encouragement from family, but no one wrote the check. Right? Go to college, it's a good thing. But no one wrote the check. So when you have to put yourself through college, there's a high level of appreciation for that. So as I am hopeful now to a degree about the future, I'm getting older as a young man in college, starting to get the first jobs in my field. I'm starting to be excited about life. Excited about life. One of the first jobs that I had was working as a foster care worker for Baltimore City Department of Social Services. That building you see is the East Biddle Street office. There, I was one of a team of foster care workers that went to some of the most challenging communities in the city. And let me explain to you what I saw. I saw children that were in need of assistance, that were in homes in which there were no food. I saw parents who were crying because they were trying to do what was right to get custody of their children, but they had so many issues, challenges, external, internal, that they were dealing with, that even though they were trying to do the right thing, they couldn't overcome substance abuse. They couldn't overcome some of the violence that they had towards their children because they were raised like that. They said, Mr. Rice, this is all I know. I'm trying my best and I'm losing my children. I don't know what to do. I should just forget it. I said, listen, you can't give up. Let's work together. I'm going to tell you the truth, but I'm also going to try to support you. But you have to do what's right. And many of these parents wanted to do what was right. I had siblings who loved one another, but I had to move them 3 to 4 times because they kept fighting each other. I'm arguing with my supervisor, trying to keep these young children together. Supervisor's like, you got to split them up. I'm working with law enforcement who's explaining to me what they saw. I'm dealing with guardian ad litems and other invested partners. I'm dealing with social workers, counselors, everyone trying to figure out, how do we help this family? How do we connect with these children? How do we ensure that the abuse stops? Everyone didn't have the same outlook in terms of reconnection or hope that I had. But when you're young, sometimes you don't know what you don't know. And that's a good thing. So, you want to put your cape on and yay, let's go out and save people and do things. You motivated. And that's good. And you should have that passion for those who may be junior or newer in the field. But when I saw those children arguing with each other at placement, it reminded me of how my sister and I would argue about our parents. My sister would argue that she would want our father to stay because they had a good relationship. I would argue I want my father to go because we didn't have a good relationship. And part of the reason my mother didn't want to leave my father was because she, one, felt it was important for a male to be in the house to help raise me, but also she saw that there was a bond that my sister had with my dad. Complex issues. My experiences were no different from those young children in foster care that I was supporting. And what I know from my experience and what I know from working with those children in foster care, that children who are exposed and experienced to domestic violence deal with it in different ways. For a while, my sister rebelled. She was a rebel. My mother would tell her to do something, she would do what she wanted to do. And I know that was connected to what was happening in the home. On the other hand, I would dig into schoolwork or other things, such as the Boy Scouts or youth group. Children exposed to violence can have a difficult time establishing healthy relationships. And what we know is that witnessing violence, and I witnessed my father being violent towards my mother, striking my mother, as well as verbal abuse. And even with my father never physically abusing my sister or I, it didn't matter. Because when he struck my mother, it reverberated with us. What they thought we couldn't hear, we heard. And that never goes away. I was speaking to my mother last year about just some of these experiences, and she said that at night it's still challenging for her sometimes to sleep because of those experiences that happened so many years ago. So witnessing violence and threats against a caregiver during the earlier years of life is associated with severe effects on children's health and development. Resulting issues can include symptoms of psychological distress, behavior disorders, disturbances in self-regulation, difficulties in social interaction, and disorganization and attachment. And we also know in some instances, it's not just even the offender that uses violence or the person that uses violence that can be a trigger. Sometimes even the victim can be a trigger because it brings back memories for children to associate the whole scene happens all over again. So I know none of this is new to you, but it's real to these families that we work with every day. But my hopefulness came from seeing some of those parents in their remediation plan do the things they need to do, connect with community-based organizations, and get their children back from a family member and say to me, Mr. Rice, thank you for that. Thank you for not giving up on me. You're the first person that really tried to help us. I said, hey, I understand. Because, when I grew up, it wasn't easy either. And I know that things can be complicated, but I'm glad that you are working towards change. And there's nothing more fulfilling than seeing that happen. Teenagers. Edgemead at Focus Point, Regimented Offender Treatment Center for At-Risk Youth. I worked there as a counselor, life skills counselor. We had young people who were referred from the Department of Juvenile Services, as well as young people who were referred from child welfare agencies. These were young people who were suicidal, homicidal, AWOL risk. These were young people that would come into the door fighting. This was probably the most physically challenging job, mentally challenging job as a practitioner that I ever had, working at that RTC. It was a small facility, no more than 15 boys on one side, 15 girls on the other side on the unit. I worked the boys unit. And when I say I worked the boys unit, we would have, out of those young people, maybe 2 of them were smaller than me. Maybe 5 of them were my size, and the rest of these kids were giants. So, you'd have to try to, now you're teaching some life skills, and they're like, what's up, Rice? Real big. And I'm like, okay, let's have a conversation. But it didn't matter, I had a good relationship with them, but also we had to restrain youth at times because we could not have them being a harm to themselves or others. Now, there were 2 types of people who worked in facilities like this. You had people who really cared about the young people, and you had some people that, not to say they didn't care, but it was a job. And that's fine in terms of how they, there's nothing wrong with that. But the young people could tell who cared, and they could tell who was there just as a job. I would hear some people say, well, you know, they don't listen and they're hard-headed. But then I would read their case records and see that this young person had someone murdered in front of them. This young person was molested by a parent. This young person was thrown out of school and created a riot because their parents were dealing drugs in the home and they were acting out and involved in a gang. When I read what some of the young people went through, I understood that overused term of resiliency. I wondered how some of them could even smile on the unit, not knowing when they would go home, who they would go home to. Some of these young people didn't have a Mr. Williams or a youth group or a mom to guide them during a time. So we're talking about marginal youth, where there's, again, this push and pull. Positive forces over here, negative forces over here, can go either way. And some youth walk between a fine line between both worlds. My hopefulness came when I saw a young person who came in our doors who was violent. And then this young person was a leader on the unit a year later. Or we were having a going away event for this young person, and they're going on home visits, and they're back in school, and they're actually, just exceeded beyond our imagination. That gave myself and other counselors hope when we could see that transformation in these young people as a result, not just of us pouring into them, but them being open to receive what we had. Working with young people can test your patience because, as you all know, we want young people to survive and thrive, but they're also going through their own process of maturation. And depending upon what stage they're at, it can be compounded by abuse and violence that they've been subjected to. But as you saw in the video, I had teenagers that I worked with who were fearless. They didn't care what was happening, what was going on. What they had seen already, nothing moved them. So these were teens that were angry at their parents. Some of them were at the facility because as that child became of age, they started pushing back. But that still wasn't good for that child to be acting that way at school, at home. Even at Focus Point, we had a rule where there should not be any relationships between the boys and the girls, and of course there would be relationships. So we would even see dating violence play out on campus, reflecting things that those children saw in their own parents' relationships. But I was hopeful. The reality is that children may decide to confront, teens may decide to confront their parent. Child is small, but once they come of age, they get bigger, they understand more what happened to them, they want to challenge that abusive parent, they may feel hatred, and they may not respect the rules or have respect for that parent. And let me say even something, I had apologized to my mother as a young person because I would get angry and argue with my mother at different times. This was when we initially got back in the home. And even for Mr. Williams, it was hard for him to deal with us in Boy Scouts initially because we felt that our moms and these other adults couldn't tell us anything because no men had supported us. We were self-made men at 16. Self-made, 16 years old. And we felt that we were able to navigate the streets of Baltimore on our own. And so when an adult tried to assert any authority on us, we wouldn't allow it. How are you going to tell me what to do? I'm navigating this complex maze, whatever. Mother, I want you to do, okay, whatever. Not worried about that. I'm worried about the real action that's happening out here. So even the young people who I would work with, I would see them having that same type of lack of respect because they felt that, well, you didn't do anything when we were in a vulnerable position. Why should I listen to you now? I'm not listening. So then even as us, as helpers connect with these young people, some of them may say, I'm not going to listen to you. Or I'm not interested in what you got to say. You're not my mother, you're not my father. I make my own decisions. And then we have to work with them to calm it down and develop a relationship of trust so they can listen. So I've worked with children, saw the best and the worst. Worked with teens, saw potential and for hope and progress. And then as a criminal justice master's student, I wanted to work more directly in the field. Now, while many people work hard to get out of jail and prison, I was working very hard to get in jail and prison. So some people get into say, oh, you're going to prison, and they're like, oh, God. I was like, oh, got a job as addictions counselor in Patuxent. Yay, I'm going to prison. People are like, okay, my family. I was like, why isn't my family as excited about this as I am? But I was excited because it was an opportunity for me to be able to work with offenders and teach. I taught classes in moral problem solving and relapse prevention. And it's so interesting because as I would walk through the prison and come into class, I would see some men and they would say to me, what's up, Johnny? What are you doing here? And I would look at them and say, what's up? What are you doing here? And we would talk, and I would see young men from my same community, from my same school, same environment, but we're on both different sides of the fence. I'm the instructor, you're the offender in class. And I would say and ask them, what happened? And what I would learn is that some of the protective factors, those things that I had, that I was plugged into, that my mom pushed me towards, they didn't have it. And they ended up making the decisions that I could have made, but didn't. And here we are, them and me, same age group, and I'm teaching this class. I didn't look at it as a disappointing thing. I looked at it as an opportunity to connect with my brothers, because they were my brothers. That's how I looked at it. They weren't them. They were guys from my community that I cared about, and they were human beings. Now, that doesn't mean that I didn't talk to them and hold them accountable and challenge them in our groups about past behavior, but they weren't aliens from outer space. These were other African-American men from Baltimore City who made bad decisions that brought them into the prison. So in these sessions, we would talk about their hopes and dreams, and many of them often would come into class, and on their notebook would be a sticker of their children. And so we would do a round robin and group, and I would ask them before we would jump into the curriculum. I would ask them, I would say, this is a beautiful picture of your child. So how are they doing? Oh, I haven't spoken to her in 2 years. Okay. Oh, how's your son? I see you have a picture. I don't know. Well, I see you have the picture taped on you. Yeah, it's my, when I get out, Rice, I want to do something different, and the only thing that's keeping me from doing certain things even in here is my children. So my goal is to reconnect, and I've made a lot of mistakes. Well, what mistakes did you make? I was abusive to their mother. I didn't provide for them financially. I was womanizing and didn't care. Rice, I was out there. But I'm trying to do something different when I get back out. So these men who are part of the Regimented Offender Treatment Program, we're going to be transitioning from Patuxent back into the community soon. And so part of their reentry was preparing them and trying to address issues that got them there in the first place. All of those men, when we would talk about fatherhood, said that they wanted to be a better dad. And when they get out, their drive and motivation was to be there for their children because, similar to my situation, many of their fathers were not there for them. So there was a sense of shame and hurt with those men because they were actually following the same cycle of their own fathers. And many of those young men said, as a teenager, I'm not going to be like my dad. And here you are, some even worse situation than your dad, you're incarcerated. So we would talk about the things that they needed to do to move forward and to reconnect with their children. In our groups, they would mention the things that they would do that disrupted their family, and many of those things are reflected here. They would use a child that they knew cared about them as a weapon. Mom would give instructions, hey, child, you're supposed to do A, B, and C before you go out. Don't listen to her, do what you want to do. I call the shots in this house. You don't have to listen to her. And many of these guys would say how they were chameleons of sorts. My dad, people love my dad. If I went outside of our household and told people that my dad was doing the things he was doing, no, not Johnny. I can't. I hear you, but I can't believe that. Not that guy. But it was real. So some of these individuals in the prison knew they were doing that. They had the ability to turn it on and turn it off. But my hopefulness came from those groups in which we had some candid conversations about moving from violence to nonviolence, and the majority of those men said, Rice, I want to change. I want to do better. I want to do something different. The question we have to ask ourselves, do we believe in change? Is it real? Is this some fantasy, some pie in the sky? Healing isn't easy. I was fortunate to be able to move from hatred to hopefulness and to healing. But some families, the reality is, they may never reconnect with a loved one due to the violence that has occurred. As I moved on to do community-based work, it was so interesting. I got an opportunity to work for the Center for Urban Families. I was the director of the Men's Services Responsible Fatherhood Program. I was the first chief operating officer for the organization. CFUF has a national reputation of working with low-income fathers and families. They also have Strive Baltimore program, which focuses on employment for men and women, and they also have other family strengthening programs. Even though I teach at Coppin State, I still am a part of the CFUF family. You know, the correctional officers, many of them who worked at the prison, didn't believe that the men would change. Some of them would tell the men to their faces, you'll be back. And it became a self-fulfilling prophecy for some of them, they would return. But there were men who were able to move forward, but they still needed help. Working at the Center for Urban Families and working with low-income fathers was eye-opening in that I got to see that child in foster care, who then was that teen in the RTC, who was then that young father at Patuxent in the prison, who's now trying to turn their life around at the Center for Urban Families. I got to see that change. One of the things that I think is important that I want to touch upon is the importance of, or some tools in terms of how to engage fathers. And these are some strategies that we used that were adopted from Futures Without Violence as well as other organizations. Naming the violence without shaming. When we partnered with the House of Ruth Maryland, which was a domestic violence organization in Baltimore, they changed their name to the Gateway Project because they used to shame men, and they saw that they had more success when they did not use certain types of language. Direct, respectful conversations are important. When we know what the dad has done, that can be very difficult and hard. But we have to have those conversations or we'll never get the space to establish trust. Referrals to batterer intervention programs. For those men at the Center for Urban Families, when we saw that they were open and willing to be considered or to consider change, we weren't the experts. So we developed a partnership with the House of Ruth Maryland in which their team would come over to our organization and do co-facilitate violence prevention groups. Those men who reported that they had an issue with violence, we would refer them to the House of Ruth, and the House of Ruth Maryland would let us come over to their abuser intervention program and talk to those fathers about all of the other resources that we provided, from education to employment to health. Enlisting others with whom he has a relationship with, and this is important. At times when my dad was very violent, there were men such as Big Jesse, we called him Big Red, and Gilbert, who were not afraid of my father and who would come over and get him out of the house when he was going through a very violent phase. They weren't domestic violence advocates. They were just good human beings that had influence with my dad that used that influence to give us one more day of safety. And I mentioned to you the importance of partnering with the House of Ruth Maryland. That partnership was important because as we started to travel the country and talk about all the great work we were doing with low-income fathers, we'd be at conferences like this and people would say, well, that's great work you're doing with these men, but how are you dealing with the violence that these fathers may be using? So we didn't put our heads in the sand and say, well, House of Ruth, that's not our job, that we're responsible. We said, no, we don't want men abusing their children or their loved ones. And that was a driver in the partnership and the collaboration that occurred. So we were able to work with men from who we both had as clients anyway to support their families. Engagement strategies, which are important. One of them is using fatherhood as a legacy. Most dads want their children to have positive memories of them. I saw that in the prison. I saw that in the groups with the fathers at the Center for Urban Families. And also, abusive fathers' empathy towards children can serve as a pathway through which fathers are able to reflect upon and decide to change their abusive behavior. They had children who drew pictures, and one of the pictures a child drew of their father was of a devil. The father saw that and was really impacted by that and never knew his child would view him that way. Fathers want to leave a legacy, so many of these fatherhood programs throughout the country, they go into the community to engage men on a volunteer basis, engage men who don't want to be engaged in some instances. But once you get them in the door by helping them get a job, getting education and other resources, when you start to talk about the violence, they can't turn away. You can't turn away from Mr. Rice once I helped you get that job you thought you'd never get. You can't turn away from me once I helped you get that car from Vehicles for Change that you need, that helped you get from point A to point B. You can't not listen to Mr. Rice and the other team members when we helped you with that child support issue so that now you're above water and you can pay your child support and you can do it in a way that's not underground. So in state government, as a VOCA administrator, as a FIPSA administrator for the state of Maryland, I got to see families who had issues of domestic violence, but also had challenges around food and nutrition, around where they're going to sleep at. They were transient, so we worked with them to get shelter and homes. My portfolio was workforce development, homeless services, responsible fatherhood. And for the first time, I saw that the same issues in Baltimore were issues that were also in Cumberland, Maryland, in the mountains, or in the suburbs, in the counties. At Vera, I provided technical assistance and training to supervise visitation grantees through the Office of Violence Against Women across this country. from Guam to Kentucky. And I met great people such as yourselves who are just committed to make a difference. Those supervised visitation centers were there because parents who tried to negotiate conflict, who were in situations in which domestic violence was present, yet the court still mandated that the abusive parent could come see the children. We worked with those centers to develop safety protocols. And I was excited when I had the opportunity to work in my own city to develop one of the first supervised visitation centers that were funded through OVW. I mentioned to you earlier that the experiences that I went through and that the children and the men and the fathers that I work with went through, the trauma associated with that may not end just because someone gets through it during that moment, but it can carry on into their adult life. As board chair for the National Resource Center on Domestic Violence, I'm involved in one of our initiatives called Adult Children Exposed to Domestic Violence Leadership Forum. Casey Keene heads that, and it's not just my story, but it's stories from so many other helpers, advocates, leaders who want to inspire people to make, inspire people to make a change. So as I start to close out, I just ask you to consider the following. What lens are you looking out of when you do this work? What's the motivation that you bring to this work? Is it a paper chase, or is it an authentic commitment to improve people's lives? Can I serve as a vehicle for change, and how can we work collectively together? As a state administrator, I would meet with people in my office from homeless services in a particular jurisdiction and say, hey, so are you familiar with the fatherhood program in your community that's worked with me? No, I never heard. Are you familiar with the DV organization? No, I've never. So I was hoping to bring together all of these people who work with the families so that they could start to figure out ways not to work in silos. And the question I want to leave you with is, are you listening? Are you trying to tell people what they need to do to be better, or are you listening to what they have to say? Do you have an attentive ear? What you see for them may not be what they see for themselves. We're facilitators of changes, not guardians. The image you see here is of my father who passed away in July. The picture at the bottom is with my father and I, my son, when he was much younger. And the picture you see this was when my son, who his final year in high school, he interned with my dad for a year. He interned with him for a year in high school because he's at the University of Maryland, his College Park, his focus, my son's focus is finance. So while I may never know what it may feel like to have a dad that's supporting and loving, my son and my daughter had the experience because my father was willing to be accountable and do the work. They had the benefit and the experience of a grandfather who was there for them, who overcompensated with his grandchildren because they're spoiled. They don't know it, they're spoiled. I tell them, they're like, oh no, it was different. But we were able to break a cycle and to do something different. And so one of the last things my father said to me was he apologized on his deathbed. And I said, what do you keep apologizing for? I said, you lived a pretty good life, Christian-based life, because, you know, he said his faith is what got him to change. But even to the end, he still was trying to make sure that we were good. I said, we're good. He's like, are we good? I said, we're good. So that picture I showed you of Baltimore City, I said to my students 3 or 4 days ago, you're just not sitting here to get a degree in criminal justice. I said, you're at ground zero, right? I said, because you don't have to go to Chicago or to Florida or to Guam or to United Kingdom. I said, you can walk off this campus and there's an opportunity for you to make a difference. So my charge to you is that you represent all parts of this country and other parts of the world. To make a difference, all you have to do and to continue to do to build upon the good things that you have done is to step out that door in your community and to continue to make a difference. You don't have to go far. Thank you.